Der Titel, und weil dieser Talk auf Englisch stattfinden wird, würde ich jetzt auch ins Englische switchen. Sie können für die Übersetzung ins Deutsche wiederum dann auch die Kopfhörer nutzen. Genau, so The Vulnerable Museum, this is the title of the next talk, and this talk will be held by Johanne Lokstrup. I would ask you to come on stage. Johanne is a curator and the founder of Heirloom Art Center in Copenhagen. This is a center which explores art and archival practices in the past and present, and the purpose is to propose new curatorial concepts and formats which have a specific viewpoint or a specific sensibility when it comes to diversity or decolonizing. Would you maybe explain a little bit, say something to your art center?
Yeah, it's an art center that me and my partner Stine Hebert started actually just a year ago. And we found that there was very little attention given to many artists and art practices being in between disciplines and also being not taken up by the institutions. So we are trying to explore how to exhibit a performance that took place in the 80s. How do we revisit these kind of artworks today?
Okay, so heirloom questions, structures within cultural institutions and outside of the institutions as well. I guess one of your topics as well, for example, to question the way things are funded. So a lot of questions which will be just like play a role today as well in this Congress. And so I would ask you to proceed to your talk. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you for the invitation. And thank you for the introduction. I really look forward to the coming days with this very promising Congress. I feel that I'm waiting a bit for my presentation. Yeah, here we go. I have called my presentation The Vulnerable Museum, and I won't be speaking about heirloom. I'll be speaking about something else. Because in recent years, many museums in the global north have started to question their cultural authority and renegotiate their own hegemonic structures. So in today's talk, I will address some of the premises for museums that are up for debate, why and what can be done. In order for me to address some of these issues at stake, I just want to make a short introduction to where I speak from. There we go. I have many years of experience in contemporary art, working as a curator in Kunsthalle, independent exhibition spaces, and at higher educations. But as the Black Lives Matter and Me Too movements started to appear, not only in the US, it became clear to me that it was time to look closer into why and in what way it happened in the art world. I found that it was interesting that the museums so clearly was a target, not so much for what they did, but rather for being passive. They merely were there as cultural symbols and therefore perfect for the protests and need for change. To use the museum as a kind of perfect target, which they in many ways are and have maybe can continue to be. Many protesters stages the scenes in the grand architectural spaces of the museum by carefully photo shooting and then spread and circulate through digital platforms, and thereby attracted more public attention and prompt action. So I conducted a PhD research in the museum's role under contemporary condition at Aarhus University in Denmark. And when I say museum, I particularly mean art museum, as that is where I come from. But I also know that many of you here today are not from museums, but I hope my thoughts on the topic can be applied to other cultural institutions than the museum. But mind you, the modern art museum was understood as an art museum based on a hegemonic time with a strong belief in progress and faith in the West as a hegemonic power, as it is coined by art historians Claire Bishop and Boris Greuze. So central for me was to investigate what role does the modern art museum play and what role can curating as a specific practice and the medium of the exhibition as a specific format of presentation that are happening in global and decolonial perspectives. In the museum, the historical objects, artworks, and artifacts on display are witnesses of the past and give the public access to a collective memory that is interpreted from a contemporary perspective. The object tells a staged history, and the world inside the exhibition is laid out in its totality. This is done through research and knowledge sharing, and the history is one that, depending on the perspectives assumed by the institution, often curators and mediators, in their meaning-making, will have various points of departure and take different routes, and always worth considering, could have taken others. In each exhibition, there is an experiment involving modes of meaning-making. Curator Anselm Franke has described the exhibition as an ontology. It explores the threshold between consciousness and form. The exhibition presents an idea of what the world is like. It can challenge our image of the world, and it can make other worlds possible, which also means that other interpretations of the past can take shape. This also goes for the field of the art and culture in programming of concerts, plays, etc. So with this talk, I would like to reflect on how the museums, through exhibitions, can own the conflict and make them productive, and relinquish their authoritative voices in favor of exposing their doubts, their vulnerability, and venturing out into unknown territories. I did my PhD from 2017 to 2020, and I find a lot has happened to the museum while I was doing my research, but also since, and I must say, is still going on, not least in the digital evolution that is taking place today. A shift is clearly going on, and I hope you can use my thoughts as inspiration for how to approach the challenges that are taking part in world making of today in a more overall way. So let me go through these topics. So from contact zones to conflict zones. How can museum own the conflict? From safeguarding culture to discussing it. How can the museum be part of the important discussions that are taking place today? Reassess and revise history. How can the museum explore it together with other participants in the field? I'll talk about that through historical examples in curating, both an old one and a more recent one. So the term contact zone is not a new concept in museums research, and I'm sure many of you here today are familiar with it, and a term I also see are being used in panels taking place later today in the conference. It was used by American historian James Clifford in his book Roots, Travel and Translation in the late 20th century from 1993 to describe the encounters that take place in the anthropological museums when objects of spiritual significance from indigenous cultures are drawn into a museum setting. And I think it's appropriate to add that Clifford got it from literary scholar Mary Louise Pratt, who coined the term. However, the idea of contact zones does not always cover what happens at the museum when cultures meet. As a starting point, it must be accepted that the museum, and even more so the anthropological museum, is in fact a conflict zone, due to its genesis in a Western context. The conflict hails from the fact that the museum arises out of a tradition of positioning itself in relation to other cultures, where the starting point is the collection as a meeting place and a site where a special Western cultural understanding is presented. This conflict raises questions about the museum's fundamental conditions, such as collection practices and traditions, ownership, and repatriations. Because the museum originates in a Western idea and tradition of explaining itself against one another, the collection is an assembly, a place that encircles its culture, and the museum takes on a conflict that is inscribed in the very constitution of the museum. The Western museums comes from the imperialist tradition with one hegemonic position and meaning-making that embeds the rest of the world, either as becoming part of the reason-making or becoming the other, something to study, to look at, to be fascinated and repelled or repelled by. Or one can be less polemic. Many ethical questions arises with the museum, which concern collection practices as well as more current discussions for the repositive of cultural heritage in the collection, and raises further questions such as who has been excluded from the history that has been told so far or been regarded as other in order to encircle the culture of Western history. Another question is, how do we tell different stories and how do we relate to the object according to our backgrounds as visitors, curators, mediators, researchers, and so forth? And how do we articulate and translate the artworks in a collection for relevant and present days concern? A particular important aspect concerns the museum's self-image. They have traditionally not believed that their task was to enter public debates on social and societal issues. Rather, their task was to preserve culture, to safeguard what they believed is important to collect for the future. But can one afford to ignore the present when the past needs revision? Perhaps the most famous example in museum history of failing to read one's own time happened in 1984 when MoMA in New York presented the extensive show Primitivism in 20th Century Art, Affinity of the Tribal and the Modern, which received a great deal of criticism for the hierarchical way in which the modernist works were presented up against their sources of inspiration in African art. The show prompted an extensive discussion on the role played by African art in the West. What MoMA has failed to register was the shifts towards a far more relativistic approach to art and a distancing from Eurocentric thinking. Less well known is the fact that in the wake of the heated discussion, the Center for African Art in New York produced the exhibition Perspectives, Angles of African Art in 1987. Here, the museum invited 10 very different collectors of African art to select works from the museum's collection and describe their own relationship with African art. Among other things, the Black civil rights activist and author James Baldwin chose a terracotta figural scene depicting a cow and two people created in Mali at some point between the 14th and 17th centuries, accompanying it with these words: "You don't realize that you're asking me very personal questions. You think you're talking about art, but you're not. You're talking about something else. You're talking about something which the West as a group has done its best to destroy. Interesting enough, Baldwin's text hung beside a contribution from David Rockefeller, a former CEO of Chase Manhattan Bank, who had purchased art on his many business trips to Africa. Rockefeller's exhibits included a wooden 20th century Fanti fertility figure from Ghana, and he described his relationship with African art quite honestly. Perhaps my insights are more political and economic than artistic or cultural. There is a lower standard of living by and large in Africa than in many parts of the world. I think they have a long way to go. And I think one of the questions that one has to ask is whether it's possible for African societies to transform themselves into what we like to think of as pluralistic, democratic societies in a meaningful sense in a matter of decades. So in this way, perspectives, angles on Africa art facilitated a polyphonic representation of different notions of and relationships with African art. And I wonder if it would be possible to envision that exhibition happening today. Would an art museum be able to put such different people in the same room? I wish one had the guts to do so. Because I believe it is time for art museums to dig out some of the more overlooked and problematic parts of their collections. What stories may be found lurking here, pointing to some of the less fortunate aspects of Western civilization. Not to make us feel ashamed of the past, but to help us understand just how extensive and far-reaching the imperialist project has been, and not the least, how the museum constitutes an important part of that development. Museums are not just exalted temples with galleries that can be emptied and filled like blank pieces of paper that can be overwritten time and time again. We need to delve deeper. A good example of an art museum that accepted this task is the Henje Onsted Kunstcenter in Norway, which presented the exhibition In Search of Matisse in 2015. The exhibition was prompted by an inquiry from an American lawyer who, on behalf of his client, asked for the return of a painting by Henri Matisse in the museum's collection. The client was a descendant of a Jewish art collector who had had much of his collection confiscated by the NS regime in Germany during the 1930s, including this painting. While Henje Onsted could not prove the provenance of the work, thereby ensuring its legal affiliation with the art museum, it could easily have chosen to make this a purely legal matter, a court case conducted out of the public eye, as many art museums do and have done over time. Instead, the museum chose to make the case the focal point of an exhibition about provenance and cultural heritage. The exhibition was divided into two parts. One presented the research into the provenance of the Matisse painting, including the other early works in the museum's collection from before 1945, which was manageable as the collection comprising only 19 paintings. The other part consisted of the work of contemporary artists who were invited to react to this specific investigation of the museum with new works, or with already created works that expressed related concerns about displacement, ethical responsibility, and retelling stories through cultural heritage. Taking a starting point in its own role in collective history writing, the museum dispelled the myth of the art museum as a neutral and autonomous place by highlighting how social and economic structures also underpin art collection. At the same time, the museum opened up a gateway to the past, making it feel current and relevant for a much larger target group than the demographic typical seen in Norwegian art museums. The museum's history became a symbol of a larger socially relevant issue, and Henje Onstad reinvigorated its role as a communicator of history. On the wall, on the picture are two paintings by Henri Matisse from the Henje Onstad collection, Le Citron from 1943 and Natur Mord, undated. The provenance is made clearly from the accompanying text and in the background you can see the Iraqi-American artist Michael Rakovich's work, The Invisible Enemy Should Not Exist, from 2007. The inquired painting, Profil bleu devant le chimney, sorry my French, by Matisse, was not part of the exhibition as it was returned before the exhibition opened. So to sum up this talk, a good practice for the museum in order to meet the challenges and negotiate their position in culture could be: one, make new friends with a divided interest. Invite those who are active in the field inside and listen to them. Try and understand where they come from and where they speak from. I see many museum curators changing in these years as they start new conversations with other parts of culture. So it's not only about inviting in, but also opening up to the outside world and see it in new ways. Second, hook up with the media before they get a hook in you. Many museums have ended up as shipwrecks in media storms that they don't seem to be able to handle so well. Somehow they simply come out as old hats and out of time. So instead of ending up in this situation, don't hire an art historian as your communication person, but hire a journalist. Or even better, get a well-known debate editor to be your consulting person. And again, make room for the debate, be vulnerable, be generous, and invite people inside in your programming. Rather do that before you are taking into a space that you do not know how to respond to. Third, use the space for reflection, which the exhibition are meant to be. Or for those other institutions here, use your programming for space for reflection. In opposite to the media and digital world, the space is physical. It is a space, as I mentioned before, where it is possible to be nuanced, be able to reflect, and see things from different angles. Again, open up, be vulnerable. There is plenty of doubt and uncertainty around, both within and without the walls of museums. Today, we face many difficult discussions and issues, and we cannot find answers to all problems of the past by going through the archives. My hope is that many more exhibitions dare to go toe-to-toe with the past, own the conflict and make them productive, and relinquish their authority voices in favor of exposing their doubts and venturing out into unknown territories. I think in the future, the authority of museums will reside in the ability to explain why they have doubts. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much for that very interesting input talk. First, I wanted to give you an occasion if there are any questions to Johanna. It would be great if you raise your hand. We have some microphones over there. And then I just noticed. But if not, I would just like to start with one question. You already mentioned a lot of questions which you can ask yourself when you just like consider or want to re-examine your curatorial or archival practice. I just wanted to know, do you have some kind of a checklist or just like some kind of setup of questions which one could ask in the beginning, how, just like to self-analyze how the actual practice has been so far?
But I think many curators already start with a lot of questions. And I don't think, well, of course, one could make a list that one could follow, but I think a lot of people from different fields of the art, working with the art, when they start working on a specific project, they will ask so many questions, and maybe they should write them down in order to revisit them. But I think you always have so much doubt in the beginning. Is this worth making an exhibition about? Is it worth bringing this out, or should it be this? And I think if you keep that in that room for thinking open, then I think you have
you have a good starting point.
Yeah.
You said it's important to invite people into the discussion.
Yes.
How do you choose whom to invite? That's a big question.
Yeah, that's a very good question, and it of course depends on the topic you're working on.
Yeah.
But I think that points back to all these different questions you have in the beginning, and you don't know how to answer them, but you probably know. You're thinking in your head, who's going to ask these questions if I don't answer them? And those are the people you should invite in. Those are the people that you see having these discussions, because you know they're going on.
You mentioned one example from the 80s of an exhibition which I think you pointed out is like a worst case scenario, or it's just like not the ideal situation. Can you think of one example which where a museum, for example, tried really to take a different path, to open up the discussion, but failed anyway, and what is to be learned from that?
Yeah, I can easily go to my own home city, Copenhagen, where there was at the National Gallery a big exhibition on Kirchner and Nolde, and I think it also traveled actually to Germany. And they did a lot on beforehand. They called it Kirchner and Nolde up for discussion. So they were really opening up for having a discussion about, it was about Kirchner and Nolde's, not their, not a typical show of them, but how they were inspired by non-Western cultures and art, and how that reflected in their practice. And they had really opened up for this discussion, but they had really mostly looked to the left side of the politics going on about these discussions. So they were really surprised to find that the right-wing politics really went against the exhibition for being way too not showing the art. For them it was not possible to see the art, and I think that they should have given room for a bigger discussion, and not only seeing that we have to include only new voices in, we also have to cover other voices, because I think what came out of that was that they went 2 steps back and did not dare to do this kind of exhibition again, forgetting all this, being in the media too much and not being able to control it.
So you would say, in a certain way, by trying to be more progressive, they excluded, again, another group of people.
Yes.
So it wasn't very inclusive in the end.
No, in a way not. Yeah.
Okay. Are there any questions from the public? I'm just like answering. If not, I will just continue. No question. As this is a congress about digital media as well, about digital culture, I would like to know, can you think of any digital formats, digital tools which help an institution like a museum to reflect doubts and critical discourses concerning their own curatorial practice or the way they deal with their collection.
Yeah, this is where I'm not. This is not my field. I have sort of I just see a lot of museums at the moment really opening their collection up in a digital way and using a lot of effort on explaining it. And but I have I don't feel that I'm the one to say, is it done in a right way? I can't tell, unfortunately.
I found it interesting because you mentioned one exhibition in Norway, and I was wondering when I was going through your talk and I was thinking about it, I thought a lot of these questions are very discursive. So I would think, just like oftentimes, if you question your own curatorial practice, that is very text-based, or it's a very discursive approach. And on the other hand, when you do an exhibition, you don't want just like tons of text in the exhibition. You want it to just like somehow explain itself in a different way. How do you deal with this problem?
I'm probably of a more conservative person on this side, because I think many institutions have become too much being afraid of writing texts.
Okay.
I see the other things happening in order for the public to come inside. But I think already we are at a stage where the museums holds already too many visitors. I think it's time to ask a bit more from the visitors also. I don't think we should avoid too much text, I must say. I'm not saying that it means that we shouldn't have the objects, but I'm not afraid of text.
And what do you think is a good format to invite the public into the discussion once you decided how you want to create an exhibition?
Yeah. I think I'm thinking of an example from Norway again at the Munch Museum, where they were looking into a specific part of Munch's paintings, where he had painted a black person who they didn't know who it was, and he had used him on several paintings. And in order to find out if anybody knew about this person, they contacted a lot of different medias, and through the exhibition, while the exhibition was on, they kept having these, inviting people to both react to the paintings and say, what should we call them? We can't just call them the N-word, as they were called. We need to call them, we need to find other, and they put it up for discussion for the audience, and they made it online. So and I heard that they have never received so many inputs from visitors and people just joining online to these questions.
So that's a good example for some digital openness.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. I'm just asking if there are any more questions, because if not, I would close this round. I think there aren't. So, Johanna, thank you so much for your input. That was very interesting. Thank you. And I have at this point just some organizational info concerning the table talks, because parallel to the next input talk, and I will switch to German now, because genau, es findet jetzt gleich ein Table Talk statt, parallel zu der nächsten Veranstaltung. Es ist ein Table Talk mit Sina Schmidt vom Deutschen Bühnenverein und Tina Lorenz vom Staatstheater Augsburg. Und das ist im Studio 3.